The 6 a.m. alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at Fort Bragg ammunition plant like a blade cutting through steel. The massive industrial complex came alive with the mechanical symphony of hydraulic systems, conveyor belts, and steam pressure gauges that had been the heartbeat of military ordnance production for over 5 decades. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with machine oil hung heavy in the cold North Carolina morning air, creating that distinctive metallic taste that every ammunition worker knew by heart. "Get out, dead weight!" Sergeant Rodriguez's voice exploded across Quality Control Station 7 with the force of a controlled detonation. His muscular frame towered over the small woman clutching a worn clipboard, his pointing finger aimed like a weapon directly at Clara Jensen's trembling hands. The 52-year-old quality inspector stood perfectly still despite the verbal assault, her weathered fingers maintaining their grip on the safety checklist with a precision that seemed to contradict the obvious nerve damage. Behind them, the massive autoclave chamber hummed with barely contained pressure, its steam gauges reading exactly 200 psi, the critical threshold where one miscalculation could turn Building C into a crater. From the elevated observation deck, Colonel Morrison watched the scene unfold through reinforced glass windows, his weathered face revealing nothing as he witnessed what appeared to be routine workplace harassment. The base commander had seen enough personnel conflicts in his 30-year career to recognize when something was about to either blow over or blow up spectacularly. Clara's safety inspection clipboard bore the scars of 6 months on the job, coffee stains, grease marks, and the kind of wear that came from hands that never stopped moving. Her gray hair was pulled back in the regulation style, and her safety glasses couldn't quite hide the crow's feet that spoke of someone who had spent years squinting into harsh sunlight and artificial light alike. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the explosive materials," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying across the production floor, where 43 personnel had suddenly found reasons to slow their morning tasks. "This is precision work. One slip of those shaky hands and we're all eating concrete for breakfast." Private Jackson, barely 22 and fresh from EOD school at Eglin Air Force Base, snickered from his position near the detonator testing station. Staff Sergeant Kim, Rodriguez's second-in-command and a veteran of 2 deployments to Afghanistan, allowed himself a thin smile as he continued calibrating the electronic timing devices that would determine whether today's production run met military specifications. Clara said nothing. She simply adjusted her grip on the clipboard, those trembling fingers somehow finding their position with an odd precision that only Master Chief Williams seemed to notice from his post near the emergency communication panel. Something about her stance, the way her feet positioned themselves without conscious thought, the subtle shift in her shoulders when she handled equipment, made the 30-year Navy veteran lean forward slightly in recognition of something he couldn't quite place. The morning formation had been routine. 47 personnel assembled in the main courtyard of Building C at 05:45 hours, their breath creating small clouds in the winter air as they listened to the day's assignments. Clara had arrived at the plant gate at 05:45, presenting her common access card to the security checkpoint with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. "Quality Control Team Alpha will handle administrative reviews," Rodriguez had announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never questioned his right to command. "EOD specialists will manage live ordnance testing and disposal protocols. We have real bomb techs to handle the dangerous work, so the paper pushers can stick to what they know." The assignment had been clear enough. Clara Jensen, along with 7 other quality inspectors, would spend her day reviewing documentation, checking serial numbers, and ensuring that every piece of ordnance leaving Fort Bragg met the exacting standards required for combat deployment. It was safe work, administrative work, the kind of job that kept civilian contractors out of harm's way, while the real military professionals handled the serious business of explosives. But Clara's badge lanyard told a different story to anyone who looked closely enough. Hanging next to her identification card was a challenge coin, its brass surface worn smooth by years of handling. The unit designation was too faded to read clearly, but the eagle and crossed cannons were still visible to those who knew what to look for. As the formation broke up and personnel moved to their assigned stations, Clara's movement pattern caught the attention of several observers. She didn't walk to her post. She moved with purpose, checking corners and maintaining situational awareness in a way that spoke of muscle memory, earned in places where such habits meant the difference between going home and going home in a box. Jensen, Rodriguez's voice stopped her halfway to the administrative section. Since you're so eager to be useful, let's see if you can handle some basic explosive identification. The EOD testing area occupied the southeast corner of Building C. Separated from the main production floor by blast-resistant walls and emergency containment systems. The space was designed to handle controlled detonations and equipment testing, with concrete walls thick enough to contain all but the most catastrophic failures. Rodriguez gestured toward a table covered with various types of military ordnance, practice rounds, training devices, and several inert explosive samples used for educational purposes. Tell me what you see, Inspector, and remember, those shaky hands of yours better not drop anything. Private Jackson and Staff Sergeant Kim moved closer, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected entertainment. Other personnel began to gather as well, drawn by the prospect of watching someone fail publicly. In the military, witnessing incompetence was sometimes more satisfying than demonstrating competence. Clara approached the table with deliberate steps, her trembling hands held carefully at her sides. She studied the ordnance display for exactly 15 seconds, her eyes moving in a pattern that suggested she was cataloging not just what she saw, but what she understood about what she saw. M67 fragmentation grenade, inert training model, she said quietly, pointing to the first item without touching it. M18A1 Claymore mine, practice version with dummy charge, composition C4 plastic explosive, approximately 4 ounces, stable at current temperature and humidity levels. Rodriguez frowned. The identification was accurate, but that wasn't the point. Anyone can read labels, old lady. The question is whether you can handle them without getting us all killed. Sir, with respect, the humidity level in this room is currently at 68%, Clara continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Military specifications require controlled storage below 65% for optimal stability of nitrocellulose-based compounds. The observation was correct, and Rodriguez knew it. The room's environmental controls had been running slightly high all week, a minor issue that the EOD team had been meaning to address. But Clara Jensen was supposed to be a civilian quality inspector, not someone who could recite explosive storage protocols from memory. Lucky guess, Kim muttered, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Those shaky hands gonna drop a detonator when it matters? Rodriguez pressed, determined to maintain control of the situation. Maybe you should stick to filing reports where the only thing you can hurt is a paper cut. The moral vacuum was complete. 43 personnel had gathered us to watch the confrontation, their morning routine forgotten, in favor of witnessing what appeared to be the systematic humiliation of someone who couldn't defend herself. Not one person stepped forward to intervene. Not one voice suggested that perhaps there were better ways to determine competence than public ridicule. Clara remained silent, returning to her clipboard and continuing her methodical notation of safety procedures. Her handwriting was precise despite the tremor, each letter formed with the kind of care that suggested someone who understood that documentation could be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. From the observation deck, Colonel Morrison made a note in his daily log. Personnel conflicts were nothing new, but something about this particular incident felt different. Clara Jensen's file was remarkably thin for someone with 6 months on the job. Standard background check, civilian employment history, basic security clearance. But there were gaps, periods of time that weren't accounted for, and Morrison had learned to pay attention to what wasn't in files as much as what was. Staff Sergeant Kim, Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying across the testing area. Since we have time before the morning production run, let's give our quality inspector here a practical demonstration. Show her how real EOD specialists handle sensitive equipment. Kim approached a workstation equipped with electronic detonation devices, timing mechanisms, and the computer interfaces used to program explosive sequences for controlled demolitions. It was sophisticated equipment, the kind that required months of training to operate safely and effectively. This is a Mark 7 electronic timer, Kim explained, holding up a device roughly the size of a smartphone, military standard for controlled demolitions. You set the delay, connect it to the primary charge, and hope you've done your math right, because you only get one chance to get it right. He demonstrated the programming sequence, his fingers moving across the digital interface with practiced efficiency. Temperature compensation, barometric adjustment, fail-safe protocols, all automated, but you still need to understand the theory behind the technology. Clara watched the demonstration with apparent interest, her trembling hands folded neatly behind her back. When Kim finished his explanation, she nodded politely and returned her attention to her clipboard. "Questions, Inspector?" Rodriguez asked, clearly hoping to expose some fundamental gap in understanding that would justify his earlier assessment. "No, sir," Clara replied simply. The demonstration was very thorough. "Good, because that's as close as you're getting to the real equipment. Now, get back to your paperwork where you belong." The dismissal was clear, but as Clara turned to leave, Private Jackson couldn't resist one final comment. "Hey, Inspector, you ever wonder why they call it dead weight? It's because that's what you become when those shaky hands drop something that goes boom." The laughter that followed was harsh and cutting, the kind of group mockery that bonded people together by excluding others. Clara absorbed it without visible reaction, simply nodding to acknowledge that she had heard and understood the message being delivered. But Master Chief Williams, observing from his position near the communications panel, noticed something that the younger personnel missed. When Clara handled the clipboard, when she pointed at the explosive samples, when she listened to Kim's technical explanation, her movements displayed a kind of procedural fluency that didn't match her apparent inexperience. Her hands might shake, but they shook in patterns that suggested someone who had learned to work with nerve damage rather than despite it. The morning production schedule called for quality control inspections every 30 minutes, safety protocol reviews every hour, and environmental monitoring on a continuous basis. Clara's assigned duties kept her moving throughout Building C, checking documentation, verifying serial numbers, and ensuring that every aspect of ammunition production met the stringent requirements necessary for combat deployment. At 0730 hours, she discovered the first discrepancy. The storage area for Composition C4 plastic explosive was maintained at a temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity level of 68%, both within acceptable ranges, but uncomfortably close to the upper limits specified in the technical manual. More concerning was the air circulation pattern, which wasn't providing adequate ventilation for the volatile compounds used in the manufacturing process. Clara documented her findings with characteristic precision, noting the specific gauge readings, timestamp, and location of each measurement. When she finished her inspection, she carried her clipboard to Rodriguez's station near the main production line. "Sergeant, I need to report a potential safety concern," she said, her voice barely audible over the industrial noise surrounding them. Rodriguez looked up from the timing device he was calibrating, his expression showing immediate irritation at being interrupted. "What is it now, Inspector?" "The humidity levels in explosive storage are approaching the upper limit for safe handling of nitrocellulose compounds. Additionally, the ventilation system isn't cycling air at the rate specified in the technical manual." "Is it within acceptable parameters?" Rodriguez asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir, but barely. The margin for error is—" "Then it's not your concern," Rodriguez cut her off. "EOD handles explosives. Quality control handles paperwork. Know your place, Inspector." The dismissal was absolute, but Clara's documentation was thorough. She returned to her station and continued her methodical review of safety protocols, making notes that would become part of the permanent record, regardless of whether anyone chose to act on her recommendations. At 0815 hours, Captain Hayes arrived for his daily inspection tour. The production officer in charge was responsible for overall operations in Building C, answering directly to Colonel Morrison for safety, efficiency, and regulatory compliance. Hayes had been commanding ammunition production units for 8 years, long enough to recognize when something in his area of responsibility was developing into a problem. "Morning, Sergeant," Hayes said, approaching Rodriguez's station with the casual authority of someone whose rank carried real weight. "How's the new quality inspector working out?" Rodriguez straightened slightly, his attention shifting from the timing device to his commanding officer. "Sir, honestly, I have concerns about Jensen's suitability for this environment. Those trembling hands make her a potential safety hazard. Has she violated any protocols?" "Not exactly, sir, but she's been asking questions about storage conditions, ventilation systems, technical specifications that are outside her area of responsibility. Makes me wonder if she understands her limitations." Hayes made a mental note. Personnel who asked detailed technical questions usually fell into one of two categories: those who didn't understand their job and those who understood it better than their supervisors expected. What kind of questions? Temperature and humidity readings for explosive storage, air circulation rates, tolerance specifications for timing devices, the kind of thing that EOD specialists train years to understand. From across the production floor, Hayes could see Clara Jensen methodically working her way through a checklist, her movements deliberate despite the obvious nerve damage affecting her hands. Something about her bearing caught his attention, the way she approached each task with systematic precision, the way she maintained awareness of her surroundings even while focused on detailed work. "I'll keep an eye on the situation," Hayes said finally. "But remember, Sergeant, asking questions isn't a violation unless someone's overstepping their authority." The morning continued with its established rhythm. Production teams assembled ordnance components, quality control inspectors verified specifications, and EOD specialists tested timing mechanisms and detonation sequences. Clara moved through her assigned duties with quiet efficiency, documenting everything and questioning nothing aloud. But her documentation was creating a pattern that would become significant later. Temperature readings that were consistent but concerning, humidity levels that fluctuated in ways that suggested maintenance issues, air circulation data that indicated the ventilation system was operating below optimal capacity. At 0945 hours, the first equipment malfunction occurred. The welding station responsible for sealing ordnance casings began producing irregular sparks, small flashes of light that wouldn't normally be cause for concern, except for their proximity to the explosive storage area. The welding operator, a civilian contractor named Mike Davidson, noticed the problem immediately and shut down his equipment according to standard safety procedures. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Davidson called out, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that made everyone stop what they were doing. "I've got a problem with the welding torch. Electrical arc is throwing sparks outside the designated work area." Rodriguez moved quickly to assess the situation. The welding station was positioned approximately 20 feet from the nearest explosive storage, well within safety margins under normal circumstances, but irregular sparks created the potential for ignition if they traveled beyond their intended path. "Shut it down completely," Rodriguez ordered. "We'll get maintenance to check the electrical connections before we resume welding operations." The decision was prudent and followed established protocol. But as Davidson powered down his equipment, one final electrical surge sent a shower of sparks across the production floor, several landing dangerously close to the loading dock, where ammunition components were staged for assembly. Clara Jensen, who had been conducting her routine inspection near the loading dock, reacted with a speed that surprised everyone watching. She moved to the emergency shutoff panel for the ventilation system, killing the air circulation that might have carried sparks into areas where they could ignite volatile materials. "Why did you do that?" Private Jackson demanded, his voice sharp with confusion and irritation. "We need ventilation for safety." "Sir, moving air carries combustible particles," Clara replied, her trembling hands already reaching for the manual fire suppression controls. "In a spark-contaminated environment, stopping air circulation prevents ignition propagation." The explanation was technically accurate and procedurally correct. It was also the kind of knowledge that came from experience dealing with explosive environments under emergency conditions. Staff Sergeant Kim recognized the tactical thinking immediately. Someone had taught Clara Jensen to prioritize preventing ignition over maintaining environmental comfort. "How did you know to do that?" Kim asked, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity. Clara finished documenting the incident on her clipboard before answering. "The technical manual covers emergency procedures for fire prevention in ammunition production facilities, sir." It was a reasonable explanation, except that the technical manual was 800 pages long, and most personnel never read beyond their specific job requirements. Clara Jensen had not only read the manual, she had internalized emergency procedures that most EOD specialists learned through months of practical training. Rodriguez watched the exchange with growing unease. Clara's response to the welding malfunction had been immediate, appropriate, and effective. Her knowledge of fire suppression protocols was more comprehensive than that of personnel with years of experience in ammunition production, and her trembling hands had moved to the correct controls without hesitation or error. "Inspector Jensen," Rodriguez said, his tone more serious than before, "I want you to show me exactly where you learned those emergency procedures." Clara opened her clipboard to a page covered with handwritten notes, technical specifications, and safety protocols copied directly from the facility manual. Her documentation was thorough, accurate, and showed a level of attention to detail that suggested someone who understood the life or death importance of following procedures exactly. Page 467, sir. Emergency fire suppression in explosive environments. Section 12.3 covers ventilation, shutdown protocols for spark contamination scenarios. Rodriguez checked the manual himself, finding the referenced section and confirming that Clara's actions had followed established procedure perfectly. But civilian quality inspectors weren't expected to memorize emergency protocols that rarely came into practical use. The fact that Clara had not only read them, but had the presence of mind to implement them under pressure, suggested a level of preparation that didn't match her supposed background. Captain Hayes, who had witnessed the entire incident from his position near the main production line, approached Clara's station with measured steps. His observation of her response to the welding malfunction had raised questions that needed answers. "Inspector Jensen," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting complete and honest answers. "I'd like to review your background file, specifically your previous experience with emergency procedures." Clara's hands stilled for a moment, the tremor pausing as if she were considering how much truth was safe to reveal. "Sir, my file should contain all relevant employment history." "Should contain," Hayes repeated, noting the careful phrasing. "But sometimes files don't tell the whole story, do they?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that both understood, but neither was ready to address directly. Clara returned to her clipboard, continuing her methodical documentation as if the conversation had never occurred, but the incident had created ripples that would continue expanding throughout the morning. Personnel who had witnessed Clara's response began to reconsider their assumptions about the trembling-handed quality inspector, who seemed to know more about emergency procedures than her job description required. At 10:30 hours, the situation escalated again. A routine inspection of the electronic timing devices revealed a calibration error that could have resulted in premature detonation during testing procedures. The error was subtle, a variance of 0.05 seconds that fell within acceptable tolerances, but represented a potential safety hazard if left uncorrected. Private Jackson, who had discovered the error during his assigned inspection, brought the timing device to Staff Sergeant Kim for evaluation. Kim confirmed the calibration problem and prepared to recalibrate the device according to standard procedure. "This is going to take about 20 minutes, Kim announced. "We'll need to shut down testing operations until I can get this thing back within specifications." Clara Jensen, who had been conducting her own inspection nearby, glanced at the timing device and made a quiet observation. "Sir, if I may, the calibration error appears to be thermal drift related to ambient temperature fluctuation." Kim paused in his recalibration procedure. "What makes you say that?" "The variance is 0.05 seconds slow, which corresponds to the temperature differential between morning startup and current operating temperature. The timing mechanism is probably responding to thermal expansion in the electronic components." The analysis was sophisticated, requiring understanding of both electronic engineering and environmental factors affecting precision equipment. Kim checked his diagnostic readings and found that Clara's assessment was accurate. The timing error directly correlated with the temperature increase that had occurred since the equipment was powered up that morning. "You're right," Kim admitted. "But how did you know that?" Clara's trembling hands gestured toward her clipboard, where she had been tracking environmental conditions throughout the morning. "Temperature has increased 4 degrees since 0600 hours, sir. Electronic timing devices are sensitive to thermal variation." The explanation was reasonable, but Kim had been working with timing devices for 5 years and had never made the connection between ambient temperature and calibration drift so quickly. Clara Jensen's diagnostic insight suggested a level of technical understanding that extended far beyond basic quality control procedures. Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the exchange from his position near the main control panel, decided that the situation required direct intervention. Clara Jensen was demonstrating knowledge and capabilities that didn't match her supposed background, and her presence was beginning to undermine the chain of command he had worked years to establish. "Inspector Jensen," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the production floor with unmistakable authority. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your actual qualifications for this position. If you're getting uncomfortable watching Clara face this escalating harassment because of what looks like incompetence, share this video with someone who understands that real expertise doesn't always look the way people expect. Hit the like button and leave a comment about a time when you or someone you know was underestimated because of appearance or circumstances. The confrontation that was building would force Clara to make a choice between maintaining her carefully constructed anonymity and revealing truths that she had spent months trying to keep buried. But sometimes the past refuses to stay hidden, especially when lives hang in the balance, and expertise becomes a matter of survival rather than career advancement. Rodriguez gestured for Clara to follow him to a quieter section of Building C, away from the production equipment and the curious eyes of personnel who had been watching the morning's events unfold. The area he chose was near the emergency communication panel, where Master Chief Williams maintained radio contact with base security and external emergency services. "Inspector, I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I expect direct answers," Rodriguez began, his tone carrying the weight of someone who wasn't accustomed to having his authority questioned. "Your knowledge of explosive storage protocols, emergency procedures, and electronic timing systems suggests training that goes beyond civilian quality control experience." Clara set her clipboard down carefully, her trembling hands finding a position of rest that somehow managed to look both submissive and prepared. "Sir, I've tried to study the technical manuals thoroughly to perform my duties competently." "That's not an answer to my question," Rodriguez pressed. "I want to know where you learned diagnostic procedures that most of my EOD specialists don't know." The question was fair, and Clara's hesitation in answering it was telling. Master Chief Williams, monitoring the conversation from his position at the communications panel, recognized the signs of someone weighing the consequences of truth against the safety of continued deception. "Sir, before taking this position, I had opportunities to observe military procedures in various capacities," Clara said finally. "I may have picked up more technical knowledge than is typical for civilian personnel." It was still an evasion, but Rodriguez could sense that he was approaching something significant. "What capacities? What kind of observation?" Before Clara could answer, Captain Hayes approached with a folder in his hand, Clara Jensen's personnel file, pulled from the base database for a more thorough review than had been conducted during her initial hiring process. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I think we need to discuss this matter privately," Hayes said, his tone suggesting that the conversation was about to take a direction that required careful handling. But the private discussion would have to wait, because at 11:15 hours, the welding equipment that had been malfunctioning earlier suddenly exploded into life with a shower of sparks that ignited a trail of spilled solvent, leading directly toward the explosive storage area. The accident unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a controlled demolition. The welding torch, which Davidson thought he had safely shut down, experienced a catastrophic electrical failure that sent a continuous stream of sparks across the production floor. The solvent, which had been spilled during routine maintenance and incompletely cleaned up, provided a perfect ignition path toward the area where Composition C4 was stored for assembly operations. Rodriguez reacted with the trained responses of an EOD specialist, immediately triggering the facility's emergency alarm system and beginning evacuation procedures for all non-essential personnel. But even as he moved through the established protocol, he could see that the fire was spreading faster than standard procedures could contain it. "All civilian personnel evacuate immediately," Rodriguez shouted over the growing noise of alarms and emergency systems. EOD specialists maintain positions for controlled evacuation of explosive materials. Clara Jensen, who had been classified as civilian personnel despite her morning's demonstration of technical knowledge, was supposed to join the stream of workers heading for the emergency exits. Instead, she moved toward the fire suppression controls with the same decisive efficiency she had shown earlier. "Jensen, get out of here," Rodriguez commanded. "This is not your responsibility." But Clara was already at the emergency control panel, her trembling hands moving across switches and valves with a precision that suggested she had operated similar systems before. She activated the foam suppression system for the immediate fire area while simultaneously shutting down electrical power to prevent additional ignition sources. "Sir, the fire is following the solvent trail toward explosive storage," Clara called out, her voice somehow remaining calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "We have approximately 30 seconds before it reaches materials that will cause structural collapse." The assessment was accurate and terrifying. If the fire reached the C4 storage area, the resulting explosion would not only destroy Building C, but would create a blast wave capable of damaging adjacent structures and injuring personnel across a significant area of Fort Bragg. Staff Sergeant Kim, who had been preparing to evacuate explosive materials manually, realized that there wasn't enough time to remove dangerous substances before the fire reached them. "Sergeant, we need to clear the area now. If those explosives detonate, this whole building comes down." Rodriguez faced a command decision that would define his career and possibly determine whether people lived or died. Standard procedure called for complete evacuation when fire threatened explosive materials. But Clara Jensen, a civilian quality inspector with trembling hands, was suggesting that she could prevent disaster by remaining in the danger zone. "Jensen, you have 10 seconds to explain what you think you can do that trained EOD specialists can't," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of someone making life-or-death decisions under pressure. Clara's response was delivered with the kind of calm precision that came from experience in situations where panic meant death. "Sir, the fire suppression system can create a chemical barrier between the ignition source and explosive materials, but only if it is activated in a specific sequence that accounts for air pressure, chemical composition, and thermal dynamics." "How do you know that?" "Because I've done it before, sir." The admission hung in the air for exactly 2 seconds before the first small explosion occurred near the welding station, sending a shockwave through Building C that knocked several people off their feet and shattered windows in the observation deck, where Colonel Morrison had been watching the morning's events unfold. Rodriguez made his decision. "Do it!" Clara's trembling hands moved across the emergency control panel with systematic precision, activating fire suppression systems in a sequence that created multiple chemical barriers between the spreading fire and the explosive storage area. Her movements displayed the kind of procedural fluency that came from extensive training and practical experience under extreme conditions. The foam barriers she created were strategically positioned to prevent ignition propagation while maintaining escape routes for personnel still inside the building. Her understanding of the chemical interactions between different suppression agents prevented the kind of dangerous mixing that could have created toxic gases or explosive reactions. But even as she worked to contain the immediate crisis, Clara could see that the structural integrity of Building C was becoming compromised. The explosion near the welding station had damaged load-bearing supports, and the intense heat from the fire was weakening concrete and steel components that had been designed to contain much smaller incidents. "Sir," Clara called out to Rodriguez, who was coordinating the evacuation of remaining personnel, "we have a structural problem developing. The support columns near the main entrance are showing stress fractures." Rodriguez followed her gaze and saw what she was referring to: hairline cracks in the concrete pillars that supported the building's main entrance, growing wider as heat and vibration from the fire created stresses beyond design specifications. "How long before collapse?" he asked. Clara studied the damage pattern with the kind of assessment capability that spoke of someone who had learned to read structural failure under combat conditions. "Unknown, sir, but the progression suggests minutes rather than hours." The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. What had begun as a routine equipment malfunction was becoming a major industrial accident with the potential for multiple casualties and significant facility damage. And Clara Jensen, the trembling-handed quality inspector who had been dismissed as dead weight that morning, was demonstrating knowledge and capabilities that suggested she was far more than she appeared to be. Rodriguez keyed his radio to contact base emergency services. "Fort Bragg Emergency Operations. This is Building C requesting immediate fire department response and medical support. We have structure fire with explosive materials and potential building collapse." The radio crackled with acknowledgement. "Building C, be advised, fire department is en route. ETA 8 minutes. Are all personnel accounted for?" Rodriguez did a quick head count of the people still visible in the building. Most civilian personnel had evacuated successfully, but several EOD specialists remained to secure dangerous materials. And Clara Jensen was still at the emergency control panel, managing fire suppression systems. "Negative, we still have essential personnel inside maintaining safety systems," Rodriguez responded. "Request priority response for structural assessment and explosive ordnance disposal support." As he finished the radio call, Rodriguez realized that Clara had moved from the emergency control panel to a position near the damaged support columns, where she was conducting some kind of detailed examination of the structural damage. "Jensen, what are you doing?" he called out. "Sir, assessing load redistribution patterns to determine safe evacuation routes," Clara replied without looking up from her inspection. The damage pattern suggests that the main entrance will be compromised within minutes, but the emergency exits should remain structurally sound for approximately 15 more minutes. The technical analysis was sophisticated, requiring understanding of structural engineering principles that went far beyond basic safety training. Rodriguez was beginning to understand that Clara Jensen possessed knowledge and experience that had been carefully hidden beneath the facade of a nervous civilian contractor. But there was no time to pursue that revelation because the second explosion, larger than the first, sent a shockwave through Building C that caused immediate invisible structural damage. Support beams cracked, ceiling tiles rained down, and the emergency lighting system flickered before switching to battery backup power. When the debris settled and the ringing in everyone's ears subsided, Rodriguez could see that the situation had crossed the line from serious to catastrophic. Building C was no longer just experiencing a fire emergency. It was beginning to collapse, and there were still people inside who needed to get out before the structure became a tomb. "All personnel, emergency evacuation now!" Rodriguez shouted, his voice carrying over the noise of settling debris and emergency alarms. "Building integrity is compromised. Use emergency exits only." But as personnel began moving toward the emergency exits that Clara had identified as structurally sound, a third explosion, this one in the underground storage area, sent a massive shockwave through the foundation of Building C. The blast was powerful enough to buckle floors, collapse interior walls, and trap several people beneath concrete debris. When the dust cleared enough to see, Rodriguez found himself in a nightmare scenario. He was pinned beneath a steel beam that had fallen from the ceiling, conscious but unable to move. Private Jackson was visible about 10 feet away, also trapped but apparently unconscious. Staff Sergeant Kim was somewhere in the debris field, calling for help but not visible. And Clara Jensen, who should have evacuated with the other civilian personnel, was moving through the wreckage with systematic purpose, checking for survivors and assessing the extent of the collapse. "Jensen, get out of here!" Rodriguez shouted, his voice strained with pain and the effort required to speak with a steel beam across his chest. "The building's coming down!" Clara approached his position with careful steps, testing each piece of debris before trusting her weight to it. Her trembling hands moved with surprising steadiness as she examined the beam that had him pinned, calculating angles and leverage points with the kind of technical understanding that came from extensive experience with structural problems. "Sir, I can get you out," Clara said, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "But I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly." Rodriguez stared at the 52-year-old quality inspector who was offering to rescue him from a situation that would challenge experienced emergency responders. "Jensen, who are you really?" Clara's trembling hands found purchase on a piece of debris that could serve as a lever, and she looked directly into Rodriguez's eyes with an expression that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "Sir, right now I'm the person who is going to get you home to your family. Everything else can wait until we're all safe." And as she began the careful process of freeing him from the collapsed beam, Rodriguez realized that Clara Jensen's story was about to be revealed, whether she wanted it to be or not. Because sometimes crisis strips away all the carefully constructed facades and leaves only the truth of who someone really is when everything else falls down around them. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance meant that help was coming, but Clara Jensen wasn't waiting for rescue. She was providing it, one trapped person at a time, with trembling hands that somehow never shook when lives depended on their steadiness. Part 2. Clara positioned herself beside the steel beam that had Rodriguez pinned, her trembling hands somehow finding the steadiness required for precision work when lives hung in the balance. The beam was approximately 8 feet long and weighed several hundred pounds, but it was positioned at an angle that created a fulcrum point she could exploit with the right leverage. "Sergeant, I need you to remain absolutely still while I work," Clara said, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been present during the morning's confrontations. Any movement could shift the debris field and make extraction impossible. Rodriguez, fighting through pain and confusion, watched as Clara gathered pieces of concrete and metal debris to create a makeshift lever system. Her movements were methodical, each placement calculated to maximize mechanical advantage while minimizing risk of secondary collapse. "Jensen, how do you know how to do this?" Rodriguez asked, his voice strained but demanding answers even in their desperate situation. "Sir, structural rescue requires understanding of physics, engineering principles, and human anatomy," Clara replied, as she positioned a steel pipe to serve as her primary lever. The technique is called cribbing and is standard procedure for urban search and rescue operations. But Rodriguez could see that this wasn't textbook knowledge. Clara's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed similar rescues before, someone who understood not just the theory but the practical realities of extracting people from collapsed structures under emergency conditions. Clara applied pressure to her improvised lever system, lifting the beam just enough to relieve the crushing weight on Rodriguez's chest. The relief was immediate, but she maintained the pressure while speaking quickly and clearly. "Sir, I'm going to count to 3, and then you're going to slide backward exactly 18 inches. Don't try to help, don't try to stand up, just slide straight back until I tell you to stop. Do you understand?" "Roger," Rodriguez managed, his military training overriding his confusion about how a civilian quality inspector had taken command of his rescue. 1, 2, 3. Rodriguez slid backward as instructed, feeling the weight of the beam clear his body completely. Clara maintained her leverage until he was safely clear, then carefully lowered the beam back into position to prevent further structural instability. "Can you move your arms and legs?" Clara asked, already moving toward the area where Private Jackson was trapped. Rodriguez tested his mobility and found that while he was bruised and shaken, nothing appeared to be broken. "I'm functional. What about Jackson?" Clara had reached Jackson's position and was conducting what appeared to be a medical assessment, checking pulse, breathing, and obvious injuries with systematic efficiency. Her movement suggested training that went far beyond basic first aid. "Unconscious but stable," Clara reported. "Probable concussion, possible broken ribs, but airway is clear and pulse is strong. He needs medical attention, but isn't in immediate danger." She began the process of extracting Jackson from the debris that had him pinned, using the same lever principles she had employed with Rodriguez, but adapting the technique to account for Jackson's unconscious state and potential spinal injuries. Rodriguez, now mobile despite his injuries, could hear Staff Sergeant Kim calling for help from somewhere deeper in the debris field. The sound was coming from near the collapsed entrance to the underground storage area, where the third explosion had caused the most severe structural damage. "Jensen, Kim's trapped near the storage entrance," Rodriguez called out. "I'm going to try to reach him." "Negative, sir," Clara replied firmly, not looking up from her work with Jackson. "That area is structurally unstable. Any additional weight could trigger secondary collapse." Rodriguez paused, struck by the absolute confidence in Clara's voice. She wasn't making suggestions or offering opinions. She was giving orders based on technical assessment of structural integrity. And despite his rank and authority, Rodriguez found himself accepting her judgment without question. "Then how do we get to him?" Clara finished stabilizing Jackson and turned her attention to the broader rescue problem. Her eyes moved across the debris field with systematic precision, reading the patterns of collapse and damage like someone interpreting a complex technical diagram. "Sir, there's a safe approach route along the north wall where the support columns are still intact," Clara said, pointing to a path through the debris that Rodriguez hadn't noticed. "But it requires moving slowly and testing each step for stability." Rodriguez followed her gaze and could see the route she was describing, a narrow path between fallen beams and concrete chunks that would provide access to Kim's location without crossing the most severely damaged areas. It was the kind of tactical assessment that required not just understanding of structural engineering, but practical experience navigating dangerous terrain. "Lead the way," Rodriguez said. Clara moved through the debris field with careful precision, testing each piece of wreckage before committing her weight to it. Her trembling hands served as sensitive instruments, detecting vibrations and instabilities that might not be visible to the eye. Rodriguez followed exactly in her footsteps, beginning to understand that Clara Jensen's knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was earned through experience in situations where miscalculation meant death. They reached Kim's position after 5 minutes of careful navigation. The staff sergeant was conscious but trapped beneath a concrete slab that had fallen from the ceiling. Unlike the steel beam that had pinned Rodriguez, this obstacle was too heavy and irregularly shaped to move with simple leverage. "Kim, can you hear me?" Rodriguez called out. "Roger, Sergeant," Kim replied, his voice weak but clear. "I can't feel my legs, but I'm conscious and breathing normally." Clara knelt beside the concrete slab and began what appeared to be a technical assessment of the extraction problem. Her hands moved along the edges of the debris, testing weight distribution and looking for fracture points that might be exploited. "Sir, this is going to require controlled demolition," Clara said quietly to Rodriguez. The concrete is too heavy to lift, but if we can fracture it at specific stress points, we can remove it in smaller pieces. Rodriguez stared at her. Controlled demolition was an advanced EOD technique that required extensive training and practical experience. Clara Jensen was supposed to be a civilian quality inspector, but she was proposing explosive techniques that most soldiers never learned. "Jensen, do you know how to conduct controlled demolition?" Clara's trembling hands paused in their assessment of the concrete slab. For a moment, the mask of civilian anonymity slipped, and Rodriguez caught a glimpse of something much deeper. Knowledge earned in places where such skills meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Sir, I have some familiarity with explosive applications and structural modification," Clara said carefully. It was another evasion, but Rodriguez was beginning to understand that Clara's evasions were protecting secrets that would fundamentally change how everyone viewed her. The question was whether this was the time and place for those secrets to be revealed. "What do you need?" Rodriguez asked. Clara pointed to a storage cabinet that had survived the collapse relatively intact. Small charges from the demolition kit, electric detonators, and approximately 50 feet of firing wire. The goal is to create controlled fractures that will break the concrete into manageable pieces without causing additional structural damage. Rodriguez retrieved the requested materials, while Clara marked the concrete slab with precise measurements, indicating exactly where charges needed to be placed to achieve the desired fracture pattern. Her technical knowledge was extensive and specific, suggesting not just training, but extensive practical experience with controlled demolition techniques. "Sir, you and I need to take cover behind that support column while the charges detonate," Clara instructed, pointing to a position that would provide protection from flying debris. "The blast will be small, but concrete fragments can cause serious injury." Rodriguez helped Clara position the explosive charges according to her specifications, watching as her trembling hands handled sensitive materials with the kind of confidence that came from years of practice. Her technique was flawless, each charge placed with mathematical precision to achieve maximum effectiveness with minimum risk. "Kim, we're going to use small charges to break up the concrete that has you pinned," Rodriguez called out. "Cover your face and remain as still as possible. The blast will be small, but there will be debris." "Roger, Sergeant," Kim replied, standing by. Clara connected the detonators to the firing wire and led Rodriguez to their cover position behind the support column. Her movements were calm and methodical, displaying none of the nervousness that might be expected from someone conducting their first controlled demolition under emergency conditions. "Sir, on my mark, we detonate," Clara said, holding the firing device that would trigger the charges. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire in the hole. The explosion was precisely controlled, creating exactly the fracture pattern Clara had predicted. The concrete slab broke into 4 manageable pieces that could be moved without requiring heavy equipment. The technique was flawless, demonstrating a level of expertise that left Rodriguez with no doubt that Clara Jensen had extensive experience with controlled demolition techniques. Working together, Rodriguez and Clara removed the broken concrete pieces and freed Kim from the debris that had trapped him. Kim was injured but mobile, able to move under his own power with assistance from Rodriguez. "Jensen, where did you learn to do that?" Kim asked, as they helped him to a safe position. Clara was already scanning the area for other potential rescue situations. Her attention focused on ensuring that all personnel were accounted for and safe. "Sir, explosive techniques are covered in various technical manuals available to military personnel." But Rodriguez knew that technical manuals didn't teach the kind of practical expertise Clara had just demonstrated. Her knowledge was earned through hands-on experience in situations where precision and timing were matters of life and death. And her evasive answers suggested that revealing the source of that experience would expose truths she wasn't ready to share. The sound of approaching emergency vehicles was growing louder, indicating that Fort Bragg's fire department and medical personnel were arriving at the scene. But Rodriguez realized that by the time official rescue teams could organize and penetrate the damaged building, Clara Jensen had already conducted a complete search and rescue operation using techniques that most emergency responders would have required hours to implement. "All personnel accounted for," Clara reported, her voice carrying the tone of someone completing a mission rather than surviving an accident. "Jackson requires medical attention for possible concussion and broken ribs. Kim needs evaluation for potential spinal injuries. No other personnel trapped or unaccounted for." It was a professional assessment delivered with military precision. Clara had taken command of the rescue operation, extracted all trapped personnel, and provided medical evaluations that would guide the incoming emergency response teams. Her performance under pressure had been flawless, demonstrating capabilities that extended far beyond civilian quality control work. Rodriguez studied Clara's face, looking for some indication of who she really was beneath the carefully constructed facade of a nervous contractor. But Clara's expression revealed nothing, maintaining the same neutral professionalism she had displayed throughout the crisis. "Jensen, when the emergency teams arrive, they're going to have questions about what happened here," Rodriguez said. "They're also going to want to know how you knew how to conduct controlled demolition and structural rescue." Clara's trembling hands found their familiar position holding her clipboard, which had somehow survived the building collapse intact. "Sir, I followed established emergency procedures as outlined in the Facility Safety Manual." It was another evasion, but Rodriguez understood that Clara wasn't going to voluntarily reveal her background. Whatever secrets she was protecting had been carefully guarded for reasons that probably extended beyond simple privacy. The question was whether the morning's events would force those secrets into the open. Outside, the sound of emergency vehicles had stopped, indicating that Fort Bragg's fire department had arrived and was setting up operations to address the building collapse. Rodriguez could hear voices and radio chatter as incident commanders assessed the situation and organized their response to what appeared to be a major industrial accident. "Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Fort Bragg Fire Department," a voice called from outside the building. "Can you hear me?" Rodriguez moved to a position where he could communicate with the emergency responders without exposing himself to additional structural hazards. "This is Sergeant Rodriguez, EOD specialist. We have 4 personnel inside, all mobile, requesting medical evaluation and extraction assistance." "Roger, Sergeant. Can you provide information about building stability and safe entry routes?" Rodriguez looked to Clara, who had demonstrated superior knowledge of structural assessment throughout the rescue operation. "Jensen, you want to brief them on building conditions?" Clara approached the communication point with systematic caution, testing each step for structural stability. When she spoke to the emergency responders, her voice carried the kind of technical authority that made people listen carefully and follow instructions without question. "Fort Bragg Fire Department, this is Quality Inspector Jensen," Clara called out. "Building C has experienced catastrophic structural failure, affecting approximately 60% of the main floor. The north wall and support columns remain intact and can support emergency entry. Recommend approach through emergency exit 3, which provides the most stable access route to our position." The technical briefing was comprehensive and precise, providing exactly the information emergency responders needed to conduct safe and effective operations. Clara's assessment of building conditions was more detailed and accurate than most structural engineers could have provided without extensive inspection and measurement. "Copy, Inspector Jensen. Be advised we're bringing in structural assessment specialists and heavy rescue equipment. Estimated time for extraction is 30 minutes. Clara acknowledged the information and returned to Rodriguez's position, where she began organizing their group for evacuation according to medical priority and mobility status. Her leadership was natural and effective, demonstrating the kind of crisis management skills that came from extensive experience in emergency situations. "Jackson goes out first because of possible head trauma," Clara announced. "Kim, second because of potential spinal injuries. Rodriguez third despite being mobile because of possible internal injuries from crushing trauma. I'll provide rear security and ensure no personnel are left behind." The evacuation order was tactically sound and medically appropriate, but Rodriguez noticed that Clara had assigned herself the most dangerous position, remaining in the unstable building until everyone else was safely evacuated. It was the kind of decision that spoke of someone who had learned to prioritize mission completion over personal safety. "Jensen, why rear security?" Rodriguez asked. "Sir, someone needs to confirm that building evacuation is complete and provide final structural assessment to emergency responders," Clara replied. "I'm the most expendable member of the team." But Rodriguez was beginning to understand that Clara Jensen was actually the least expendable member of their group. Her knowledge and capabilities had made the difference between successful rescue and potential casualties. Without her expertise, at least 2 people would still be trapped beneath debris, waiting for professional rescue teams to organize and implement extraction procedures. 20 minutes later, Fort Bragg emergency responders had successfully extracted all personnel from Building C, and transported Jackson and Kim to the base medical facility for comprehensive evaluation. Rodriguez received treatment for minor injuries and was released to return to duty pending completion of the accident investigation. But as Rodriguez watched Clara Jensen being interviewed by accident investigators, he realized that the morning's events had raised questions that couldn't be answered with simple explanations about studying technical manuals. Captain Hayes, who had been coordinating with emergency responders throughout the rescue operation, approached Rodriguez with Clara's personnel file and a concerned expression that suggested the investigation was revealing discrepancies that required explanation. "Sergeant, I need to discuss Inspector Jensen's background," Hayes said. "Her performance during the emergency suggests training and experience that isn't documented in her official file." Rodriguez looked across the evacuation area to where Clara was providing her statement to investigators. Even under intense questioning, she maintained the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the crisis. "Sir, what did you find in her file?" Hayes opened the folder and pointed to several sections that had been highlighted during his review. Employment history shows 6 months at Fort Bragg, previous work in administrative positions with defense contractors. But there are gaps, periods of time that aren't accounted for, references that can't be verified, and educational credentials that don't match the technical knowledge she demonstrated today. What kind of gaps? 8 years, Sergeant. 8 years where Clara Jensen's location and employment aren't documented in any official records. She appears in the personnel database like she materialized out of thin air 6 months ago. Rodriguez studied Clara's face as she answered questions from the investigators. Her responses were precise and factual, but she maintained the same pattern of careful evasion that had characterized all her interactions. She was protecting secrets that someone with her obvious capabilities shouldn't need to hide. "Sir, what do you think she's hiding?" Hayes closed the personnel file and watched Clara with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating people whose official records didn't tell complete stories. "I think Clara Jensen is exactly who she appears to be. Someone with extensive military training and experience who has chosen to work in a civilian capacity for reasons she's not prepared to share." The assessment was reasonable, but it raised additional questions about why someone with Clara's obvious qualifications would choose to work as a quality inspector at an ammunition plant. People with her level of expertise usually pursued careers that utilize their advanced skills rather than hiding them beneath facades of routine administrative work. Before Rodriguez could pursue the question further, Colonel Morrison arrived at the evacuation area with a small group of officers who had been observing the rescue operation from the command post. Morrison's expression suggested that he had recognized something about Clara Jensen that the other investigators had missed. Morrison approached Clara directly, his movement purposeful, and carrying the kind of authority that made everyone else step back to provide space for a conversation that appeared to have significance beyond routine accident investigation. "Master Sergeant Jensen," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly across the evacuation area. Clara's reaction was immediate and involuntary. She straightened to attention with the automatic response of someone whose military bearing had been earned through years of service rather than learned through training. The posture was unmistakable, and everyone within earshot understood that Colonel Morrison had just revealed something fundamental about Clara's identity. "Sir," Clara replied, her voice steady but carrying recognition that her carefully maintained anonymity had just been stripped away. Morrison studied Clara's face with the kind of recognition that comes from shared experience in places where such meetings don't occur by accident. Bronze Star recipient, Purple Heart, 4 tours in Afghanistan. Explosive Ordnance Disposal Specialist with 847 confirmed disposals. Master Sergeant Clara Jensen, United States Army, retired. The revelation hit the assembled personnel like a controlled detonation. Rodriguez felt his understanding of the morning's events shift completely as he realized that the trembling-handed quality inspector he had dismissed as dead weight was actually a decorated combat veteran with more EOD experience than his entire unit combined. "Call sign Bomb Whisperer," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the respect reserved for warriors who had earned their reputations in combat. One of only 12 EOD specialists to survive more than 400 IED disposals in active combat zones. Clara's hands, which had been trembling throughout the morning, had gone completely still. The nervous energy that had characterized her civilian persona was replaced by the calm steadiness of someone who had learned to function under pressure that made the morning's building collapse seem routine. "Sir, My service record is classified, Clara said quietly. Not from me, Master Sergeant, Morrison replied. I was the officer who recommended you for the Bronze Star after the Kandahar incident. 3 IEDs, 2 wounded soldiers, and 17 hours of continuous disposal work under sniper fire. The details of Clara's service record began to explain everything Rodriguez had witnessed during the rescue operation. Her knowledge of controlled demolition, her understanding of structural engineering, her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, all earned through years of service in situations where miscalculation meant death for herself and the soldiers depending on her expertise. The tremor? Rodriguez asked, understanding now that Clara's nerve damage wasn't a civilian workplace injury. IED blast, final tour, Morrison answered. Saved her unit, but took shrapnel to the nervous system. Medical retirement with full honors and a recommendation for civilian employment that wouldn't stress damaged nerves. Rodriguez looked at Clara with complete understanding for the first time. She hadn't been hiding her military background out of shame or deception. She had been protecting herself from the kind of expectations and pressures that came with recognition. Working as a civilian quality inspector allowed her to use her technical knowledge without the physical demands that her injuries made impossible. Now, Master Sergeant, why didn't you say something? Rodriguez asked. Clara's expression showed a weariness that spoke of someone who had answered similar questions many times before. Sir, people see the uniform and expect capabilities that injuries have taken away. It's easier to let them see weakness they can understand than strength they can't accept. The explanation was profound in its simplicity. Clara had chosen anonymity not because she was ashamed of her service, but because she understood that recognition would create expectations she could no longer meet. Working quietly as a civilian contractor allowed her to contribute without the pressure of living up to a reputation earned in circumstances her damaged nerves made impossible to repeat. But when it mattered, when lives were on the line, you stepped up anyway, Rodriguez said. Sir, that's what soldiers do, Clara replied simply. We serve regardless of recognition or rank or whether our hands shake. The mission comes first. Colonel Morrison nodded with satisfaction, his assessment of Clara confirmed by the morning's events. Master Sergeant, I'm updating your personnel file to reflect your actual service record. Fort Bragg needs to know who you really are. Clara's trembling returned as she considered the implications of having her military background revealed. Sir, with respect, I prefer civilian status. It allows me to contribute without the complications that come with recognition. Negative, Master Sergeant, Morrison said firmly. Today you saved the lives of 3 soldiers using skills earned through honorable service to your country. That service deserves recognition, and these soldiers deserve to know they were rescued by someone who understands what service really means. Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier dismissal of Clara replaced by the respect she had earned through demonstrated competence under pressure. Master Sergeant, on behalf of myself and my unit, I apologize for this morning's treatment. We acted with ignorance and disrespect towards someone who has given more for military service than we understood. Clara nodded acknowledgement of the apology, but her expression suggested that recognition was less important to her than simply being allowed to continue serving, in whatever capacity her circumstances permitted. Captain Hayes approached with documentation that would formalize Clara's change in status, from civilian contractor to recognized military veteran. Master Sergeant Jensen, I'm recommending you for appointment as Chief Safety Advisor for Fort Bragg Ammunition Operations. Your expertise could prevent future accidents and save lives. Clara considered the offer carefully, weighing the benefits of official recognition against the complications that would come with return to military status. Her service record spoke of someone who had always prioritized mission accomplishment over personal advancement, and her decision would reflect those same priorities. Sir, I accept the position on the condition that my primary responsibility remains ensuring the safety of personnel rather than advancing my own career, Clara said finally. Morrison smiled with approval. Master Sergeant, your conditions are exactly what I would expect from someone with your record. Welcome back to active military service. As the formal ceremony concluded and personnel began the process of cleaning up from the morning's emergency, Rodriguez found himself reflecting on the lessons learned about judgment, respect, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on appearance rather than capability. Clara Jensen, Master Sergeant Clara Jensen, had taught them all that strength comes in many forms, that service continues regardless of recognition, and that sometimes the most valuable people are those who choose to serve quietly rather than seeking attention for their contributions. But as Rodriguez watched Clara reviewing safety protocols with renewed authority, he noticed that she had received an encrypted message on a military-grade tablet that hadn't been part of her civilian equipment. The message was brief, but Clara's reaction suggested it contained information that would soon test her decision to return to active service. The tablet displayed coordinates for a location in eastern Afghanistan, along with a single line of text. Operation Desert Memorial requires senior EOD consultant. Voluntary assignment. Transport leaves Tuesday 0600 hours. Clara studied the message for exactly 10 seconds before closing the tablet and returning her attention to the safety protocols that would govern Fort Bragg's ammunition operations. But Rodriguez could see that she was calculating something more complex than procedural compliance. "Master Sergeant, everything all right?" Rodriguez asked. Clara's trembling hands found their position of rest, but her expression carried the weight of someone considering choices that extended far beyond Fort Bragg's boundaries. "Sir, sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and sometimes that's exactly what the mission requires." She placed the tablet in her equipment bag and looked across the damaged Building C toward the flag flying at full staff over Fort Bragg's command center. The flag represented everything she had served to protect, everything she had sacrificed to defend, and everything she would continue supporting, regardless of whether her hands shook or her nerves betrayed the damage earned through honorable service. "Roger that, Master Sergeant," Rodriguez said, understanding that Clara Jensen's story was far from over. "Whatever comes next, you won't be facing it alone." Clara smiled, the first genuine smile Rodriguez had seen from her all day. "Sir, real soldiers never serve alone. That's the first thing they teach you, and the last thing you learn." And as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's damaged ammunition plant, Master Sergeant Clara Jensen began planning for missions that would soon require every bit of expertise her trembling hands had earned through 8 years of classified service in places where bomb disposal meant the difference between soldiers coming home and soldiers being carried home. The recognition she had tried to avoid was now public knowledge, but the service she had never stopped providing would continue in new forms that honored both her capabilities and her limitations. Because sometimes the best soldiers are those who understand that true strength isn't about what you can do, it's about what you choose to do when everything else has been taken away.
These stories end here, but the journey continues. Many new episodes are waiting for you. And if you enjoy, please take a moment to like, subscribe to our EV Story channel, and turn on the bell. See you in the next story.